After that brief discussion, I'm going to invite the Education Resource Ambassadors to go to room 1 to complete the conversation that we started in Turkana. So let me invite Dr. Keith Nurse, and let me invite, I saw him for 1 minute and he's not there. Chief of Staff, if she can bring me the copies of the proposal for the Diaspora Center that George had. Oh, I think he put them at the table. Thank you. We don't have one for everyone, so we leave a few copies and everything. Ian, can you help Freddie distribute some of this? A few tables. A few at each table. And Dr. Nurse and I will just walk you through some mere skeletal outlines with a view to, for those of you who are interested, if you can express that, indicate that interest to my Chief of Staff. Arlene, can you raise your hand? If you're interested in getting an electronic copy of the proposal, let Arlene know and we'll send you a copy. The idea is to get feedback, input, as we refine it and take it forward. So what I'll do is share a few thoughts.
Much credit to you and Jerry for pulling all of this together. In fact, the idea for the conference and the idea for the center are coterminous. We see the conference as very much a critical element of the diaspora engagement process. I just also wanted to again thank IGLO for taking the bull by the horns. Because I've been working on this area for a very long time now. And it's, as you can see, based on my presentation, but also many of the presentations that took place during this conference, that the diaspora is a really critical element of the social, economic, and political fabric of the Caribbean. And we need to be investing more in the process. I think that's the broad rationale. But one of the things we do too well in the Caribbean is just talk. And what I have found with IGLO's leadership is a capacity to get beyond the talk very quickly. I think any of us who know him well enough knows that he's a man of business. And so when he asked me to pursue this, I was readily able to do so and willing to do so. What we have in mind is this, is to occupy this vacant space, as I would just put it, which is to operate as a regional entity and build some institutional capacity. And that institutional capacity, in our minds, has to do at least three things. It has to facilitate the research, mapping, documentation process. As you can see from much of what we discussed over the last 2 to 3 days, is that although we have a fair understanding of what the diaspora means for the Caribbean, there are a lot of gaps in our data sets, there's a lot of gaps in our research, and there's a lot of gaps in terms of strategy. So research is critical element of this, and for good reason. This is being pioneered by the University of Guyana. A second key component of this process is training, both at the graduate, postgraduate in particular, but also specialized training for key institutions. So just to give you an example, I do a lot of work with tourism agencies all around the Caribbean. And often when I mention to them the term diaspora tourism, I get some blank stares back at me. Then I begin to tell them the quantum or the share of their visitor arrivals that are diaspora. And the blank stares still continue. Because in most of our tourism agencies, the concept of a tourist doesn't look like us. And so the strategy is premised on some misinformation, one could add. So, but this also brings us to the point that the objective is not just to do research and just do training, it's actually to engage with some very specific communities, and what I would also argue, strategic partners. So for example, the tourism industry in the region is an important strategic partner, and consequently, if we are to set up, and we are setting up a diaspora center, engagement center, then the Caribbean Tourism Organization would evidently be an important partner. Similarly, because of the significant finance that flows through the region as a result of the diaspora, an organization like the Caribbean Development Bank would obviously be an important strategic partner. And then you could talk about the areas of trade, you could talk about the areas of political engagement, etc., etc. And the objective there would be to collaborate and coordinate our efforts with key institutions that are already engaged in some of these activities, but is to ensure that there's a higher level of synergy taking place so that the outreach and engagement at the Caribbean side would be important. Now, another element of this is ultimately engaging directly with the diaspora. This requires some level of knowledge, because where are all the hometown associations? Who's the leadership? Who are the contact persons? And we know that changes from time to time. But in a digital age, what we would want to do is create a structure that is able to tap into these communities utilizing the latest technologies. So the term digital diasporas is evident and I think relevant for this process. And so that becomes another key element of the equation. How do we then become the pivot around which a whole range of institutions, not just in the Caribbean, but outside of the Caribbean, can feed into and contribute to the process? The last point I want to make, and I think it's something that we often leave aside, maybe not intentionally, is the issue of youth engagement. And in this regard, I think we need to have a strong element targeting young persons, but young activists, young entrepreneurs, etc. So one of the key elements that is embedded in the proposal, maybe not well elaborated as yet, particularly where it's focused on entrepreneurship, is to create an incubator accelerator program for diasporic entrepreneurship. Because ultimately, what we want to do is grow the pie. We want to make the pie that represents the Caribbean and the Caribbean diasporic space bigger. We want to ensure that it is our technologies, our capabilities that are better represented in the process. And in this regard, I think some of the efforts that are being pursued here at the University of Guyana are of importance. So, ramping up the business school. And so, for example, one of the things I discussed with IFLAW, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but for me, a key area where the University of Guyana can begin to make important strides and differentiate itself from the other universities in the region is to target the new areas in the global economy, which are largely underserved by the universities, let's call them the incumbents. So, working on the diasporic economy, or working on the green economy and the sustainable development goals areas, climate change adaptation, many of the new resource-based areas for expansion, which Guyana has some strong capabilities in, are some of the areas which are largely underserved. And for good reason. These are new transversal areas in the global economy. And the traditional university, which is premised on silos, so you have social sciences here, humanities, natural sciences, and so on, are outdated constructs. So humanities enrollment at UWI has plummeted, but not only at UWI, almost everywhere in the world. The demand for humanities has dropped significantly. And ironically, the term digital humanities has emerged. And the demand for content generated by humanities has exploded at a rapid rate, except that universities are not in a position to take advantage of that. And so, in an era of technological disruption, you want to be on the right side of the disruption process, and in fact, take in front, as we say in Trinidad. So, the Diaspora Engagement Center, as ambitious as all of this sounds, what we want to do is start by putting up our shingle. Start by taking some of the output from this conference and to begin to create a resource base. So for example, we can create a diaspora observatory, just taking the existing data and some of the existing literature and putting that up on our website in an organized framework begins to assert ourselves as the Caribbean Diaspora Engagement Center. And so I would want to stop at this point and invite any further comments from my floor or any comments or questions from the floor. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Great. Thank you, Keith. Let me say two things and then we'll open it for comments. I will really welcome the comments being brief because I'd like to give people an opportunity to share their thoughts in a more fulsome way in an email. If you have not received a copy of the proposal and you're interested, we can get an electronic copy for you once you indicate to Arlene. I mentioned on Monday when we began the apprehension of parts of our diaspora given the vicissitudes, political and racial in Guyana. And I know that if the University of Guyana does not reach out and try to bring under a diaspora tent the skills and talents, so much of the skills and talents that are out there will not be brought in. I say that to say that although I know the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has a database, I see the Diaspora Engagement Center we're establishing as establishing an independent database. We need to do the skills mapping and have people in the context of that skills map facilitate the engagement with us, whether it's for Guyana or for St. Lucia or for Antigua or Jamaica or what else. And so I see one of the elements of the work plan, in addition to the observatory, which is a low-hanging fruit, is to establish a talent database that can allow us to know who is where, who has what skills and interests, how might we, not a government ministry, and this is one of those cases where it's going to be necessary to have duplication of some kind, because many of us who live in the diaspora, where there is a multiplicity of our people, know what the resistance and the apprehension are all about. I think it's also important that the work plan for the Diaspora Engagement Center be one that facilitates the second conference of this kind. I would like not to have the university be the umbrella under which this is done the second time, but the Diaspora Engagement Center. I would like the Diaspora Engagement Center to be the one that holds workshops in the diaspora. Whether the diaspora is Jamaica, or the diaspora is London, or go to the diaspora and have the conversations about things that matter there. Not only have the conversations here. We're going to need a leadership, and we're proposing, as you'll see in the proposal, at least a starting leadership. In the absence of funding right now, he's not here as yet, but I've said to Dr. Jerry Yaw, you need to be the interim director. We're fortunate to have a Guyanese in the diaspora, Dr. Wazir Mohammed, willing to come back to Guyana to be part of the leadership of that. Wazir cannot come back until the spring. He has to go back and teach. But we're going to start with a core leadership that says we have an executive small team. We're going to support that team until we get funding to hire folks from the university. But we'll need to build, as you will have seen, or you will see in the proposal, an advisory board. We shall be asking some people here and some people not here to come and be part of this effort of building the center by serving in a capacity not only to tell us what to do, but to help us do it. How can you connect the resources necessary? How can you help extend the arm and reach out and touch and get some of those partnerships going? And the partnerships have got to be across the spectrum. Business, academic, international, governmental, and so on. But let me say finally, before I open it up for questions, we strove desperately to get as much sponsorship for this conference. And my intent is, if there is $1 remaining after we'll have paid all the bills, that would be the first dollar going to the Diaspora Engagement Center. But if you want to augment that dollar, let me know. I am in the augmentation receipt business. We've got to find a way to self-help. So many of our colleagues within and outside of Guyana like to pontificate as to what should be done. A lot about guitar. We have an opportunity to do guitar with this Diaspora Engagement Center. So let me stop there and invite a few questions. We'll just take 2 and 2. And the idea is to revise this forward. We'll talk a little bit more on Friday. We will, to use Keith's term, hang up the shingle, get business going on Friday when we formally declare this thing open. I'll tell you one thing, I was trying to get Keith to come and help this thing. But I know Keith makes so much money and all the things that he does and all the commitments. I know Keith is not going to leave Barbados and come to Guyana to run this thing. But he will be an intimate part of the moving this forward. Let's get a podium mic. So we'll take 2 here if any. And then I'd like to invite all the diaspora, all the ERAs to meet in room 2.
Thank you. My name is Oslin. I am an administrator responsible for economic and workforce development at York College, CUNY, in New York City. And I'm a very proud Guyanese. I'm not a graduate of UG, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, you could probably tell by my accent, but I'm not. But I'd like to first put my hand up to say that I'd love to be part of that committee and commit to fundraising. And the reason I say that is because you may not, some of you may know, some of you may not. York College is in Jamaica, Queens, and it is in the heart of, as it's referred to, Little Guyana in New York City, at least one of them. There's another one in Brooklyn. And I think this is a great opportunity, this center, to tap into the many members of the diaspora in that community. And I wanted to, my actual question, or my actual comment, aside from the taking up of the mantle to be part of what you were talking about, Dr. Griffith, is this idea of engaging youth. One of my concerns about wonderful initiatives like this is that you know, we are all in the same company. For most of us sitting here, we're all the same generation. And very often young people, and I work with young people, I work with a lot of students who are in college, but also not in college. So the college I work at happens to have a lot of outreach activity to non-degreed people. People who are participating because they're trying to get other trainings that don't lead to degrees, or just other sort of enjoyment. So my question / comment / request is that this center also take into consideration that there may be people who are interested, who are either first generation, who are not familiar, or they're third generation, and so their interest is not academic. It's not being affiliated with a center like this so that it's educational in nature. It may just be having a better understanding of their background, of their culture, who they are as an individual. So I just implore that this include things beyond sort of academic and business activities. Be also about culture building, identity building, connecting back to your roots and so forth. So that's my comment.
Great, great suggestion. Let's go to the back to Mr. Bowling, Chet. And then we'll come to the front to Mr. Curtin, Wesley.
Chet Bowling, I'm planning committee. One question and one apprehension I think I have personally, and I know a couple of other members in the planning committee and other people concerned have, is, and I'd like probably to address this question. Perhaps the full answer needs to be offline, maybe over some rum with you and Keith perhaps. But in your mind, how will the center be structured to ensure continuity? Say for example, after, God forbid, you know, there's change in the leadership of the university, or there's change in government or some other factor that we know that the reality is, you know, how in your mind, what instruments, what organizational, or what, you know, will be put in place to ensure that its continuity, that it continue to exist independent of the university, of the government, of any other significant influences at this point? Thanks.
Very good question, very good set of apprehensions. There are three key variables to any institutional continuity matrix. Variable number one is legislative. Variable number two is leadership. Variable number three is finance. The center will need to have its bylaws or rules that will establish a continuity project beyond an individual. So I'm comforted that we will have to get there, setting the stage for that kind of institutional continuity. the leadership will have to be also in the context of roles and responsibilities that are to be filled and executed, not only in relation to the founding players. And then quickly, in order to ensure that there is a leadership, that there is a director, for example, that there is a secretariat. One of the things I have in mind for the center is the connectivity between the teaching and research to establish some diaspora fellows, people who would come from the diaspora, maybe spend 2 months, 3 months, 1 month, do a combination of teaching, outreach. Will have to be funded. Maybe that they come at their own steam, but they should not have to pay for their own housing when they're in Guyana. They should not have to pay for their own local transportation expenses. Some set of funding that enables the continuity of effort predicated on the legislation and the leadership. So I don't have any worry about continuity beyond Ivor Griffith. But we've got to be sure that those three, and there are other elements in that matrix, we've got to be sure that at least those three key variables, a legislative framework, some bylaws, some guidelines, some whatever, a leadership team that is both executive and advisory, and funding. And we can't have the funding be from one single source. We want to build a package of relationships. Donna, for example, is a very influential person in the banking sector. Donna's looking at me to say, Ivor, when are you going to come and ask me? I said, Donna, tomorrow. I'm coming to you in your bank and say, give us the first $100,000, not Guyanese, American money. So, check, those would be my first reaction, but I want to see if Pete has any.
Okay, I'll just comment on that particular sustainability issue. For any institution, the key element to add to what Ivor has suggested is demand. Are there people and institutions that are demanding the services that you are offering? And if there are, then that demand framework will sustain the organization, because you'll be able to attract resources, earn respect, contribute to people's lives. And that's why the institution is anchored at the University of Guyana, and for good reason. In my presentation last night, I showed the data. Guyana is possibly the country in the region that is the most dependent on the diasporic economy. And so the fact that that gives relevance to the leadership coming from Guyana and from the University of Guyana, because this is of such critical relevance to the sustainability of the space that we call Guyana. But the objective is to be regional in scope and perspective. And that's why we indicated that organizations like Caribbean Tourism Organization, Caribbean Development Bank, in fact we've had informal discussions with these organizations, and there is buy-in. What we have to do is create that institutional structure within which they can contribute and participate. The youth question, and I really like the idea of the engagement with direct communities. The data that we have is probably a few years old, but not much probably has changed. But the Caribbean population in New York, for example, meaning the diasporic or immigrant community, is larger than any other immigrant community in New York. If I remember correctly, the Chinese account for about 6% of the immigrant population. But just the Dominican Republic alone is in excess of the Chinese. So if you add all the others, the Guyanese, the Trinidadians, the Jamaicans, etc., etc. So if we use global cities, New York, London, Toronto, Miami, Paris, Amsterdam, etc., as nodal points to pivot around and start targeting particular communities, particularly young people. And that's why I mentioned the idea of digital diasporas. Now, the only way we can engage in all of these spaces is in a digital framework. But you do have to send some bodies, some human beings to the spaces as well. And in fact, the thing about it is we have human beings in those spaces already. And so when Ivor talks about having adjunct fellows, research fellows, and so on, the objective is to have as many tentacles in as many locations as possible. Now, there are a whole range of researchers and academics and entrepreneurs and activists who are working in the diaspora, immigrant, and migration issues. The goal is to tap into those communities and spread the tentacles as widely as possible. So, yeah.
Good. So we'll take just two more. Wesley Curtin. We'll take just three more. And let me recommend that brevity is the hallmark of continuity of this conversation, because we do want before 3:30 to have the ambassadors meet in room 2. Before I forget, let me honor the commitment I made to Raquel. There are still a few spots for the Essequibo tour, and there are 2 spaces needed to fill the Pomeroon tour. If you have an interest in any of those 2 or any other of the tours, please go as quickly as you can to the room where the
initiatives that need to be undertaken. How do we advocate for this, whether it's for financing or whatever else we need to get put in place? And the reason I ask that question is that whether we like it or not, in the diaspora, we're quite fragmented. Fragmented even within nationalities and also when it comes to the wider, between individual nationalities and when it comes to the wider Caribbean. Just recently, well not just recently, for some time now, we the diaspora have been working with the US administration in what is now emerged as the new US Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act. In getting that act on the road, we try to mobilize as many Caribbean organizations in the diaspora as possible with a common goal to advocate, to lobby, to identify priorities and so on. But when it seems that when someone is not a master of whatever they're doing, not a boss, nobody wants to be an Indian, everybody wants to be a chief. So I just want to know, how are you going to deal with that kind of situation where when it comes, at the research level, I don't think there'll be a problem, but when it comes to the advocacy and implementation, particularly looking for funding, questions are going to be asked. In talking to Marco Rubio about, he's the chairman of the Western Hemisphere subcommittee on budget. He asked quite clearly who we are, who you speak on behalf of, how many people, how many, and they look, in that case, they're looking about how many people, how many votes.
I'm going to take a shot at it, and then if Pete wants, he'll offer. We're likely to have with this project what is a common denominator of all sorts of engagements. Maybe 80% of the people standing on the fence and criticizing. Maybe 10% of the people actually engaging and making a difference. And the rest don't even know something happening. Ours is going to be the task of finding among the 10%, moving towards converting the 80% to be, rather than simply critics, but engage. Ours is going to be the responsibility to find a few champions. And I think the value of what the Diaspora project would mean is the necessity to find champions among various constituencies. Glen Cann will be at one of the champions because it is in his economic interest to have his market share be expanded. He mentioned, for those of us who were here for his session, he wants to get to Cuba. He wants to get to the Dominican Republic. He wants to expand his market. I can see a Glen Cann being one of the non-academic champions. We've got to establish 5 or 6 champions, key champions that are people of influence. Private sector influence, diplomatic influence, governmental influence, academic influence. But here is one of the realities, I think, that is still true of our region and true of so many parts of the developing world. We're going to have champions from outside the Caribbean. Kwame Nkrumah wrote a book years ago in the 50s. And one of the points he made there is that decolonization of the mind is the hardest part of the decolonization. We in the Caribbean still like to have a white man come and tell us what we already know. We like someone from Europe or America. So I'll tell you, I will be looking for champions in Europe and in North America who can help us move the message and get the funding and get the projects going. Critical to that, moving the 80% critics, naysayers, is marketing what we do. A few of us sat last night, and I don't know if Wayne is still here. Wayne made the important observation that we have got to quickly sell the messages of the success of this conference so that people can see the value of having been here. Because a lot of critics who's standing on the 80% category saying, well, you know what, So we've got to ensure that there's a messaging, there's a marketing, that there are champions who are who help to open the doors for the funding, for the advocacy. And it is an easier sell if you are going not always in the mendicant mode, but you're offering someone to increase their market share if they invest X. Or you enabling a policymaker in some part of the geographic constituency to understand. You know, I suspect that many of the politicians in the Caribbean really don't understand the empirical dimensions that you explained last night. They may know polemically, generally, that the diaspora is important. But I don't think they've actually seen the evidence enough to convince them that they need to become advocates and champions. The onus is going to be on the Senate to hold the workshops for policymakers, to hold the workshops in places where the diaspora are, to ensure that we can sell and move that 80% sideline critics to be 70 and 60 and 40 and 50.
The other key thing is to notice this. We are not the only game in town. Almost every Caribbean government is now focused on some aspect of creating some institutional capacity to deal with the diaspora. So on the slide coming over here, I see that the Trinidad and Tobago government has a registration process for people from the Trinidadian diaspora. There's a website for them to go on, etc., etc. Jamaica has been further ahead. They've been doing a diaspora conference for several years now. They have a diaspora research institute, and so on. But nobody is connecting the dots. Typical Caribbean scenario, one can argue. But you know what is interesting, particularly from presentations from the Mexicans and from the Indians? Now, those are very large countries. One could almost call them continents, with very large diasporas in the million, 25, 30 million, and so on. And the diaspora economy, as a share of their economy, is somewhere between 2 and 3% of GDP. In the case of Guyana, it's 25% and upwards. the imperative of moving in this direction shouldn't be in question. In fact, we are very late. And the objective is to sell this idea that we need to move faster in this direction. And if you look at what's happening globally, the traditional multilateralism of the post-World War II era is in pre-collapse. Do we want to wait until it's a crisis and then hope for the best? The answer is no. The diaspora is our backativity. But we need to be strategic about it. One of the terms that I've been using in the last few years relates to the point that was raised. The term I use is it's called implementation deficit disorder. It's a major disease in the Caribbean. All our institutions are undershooting and underperforming. Name the institution, so is the case. In Africa, in Asia, throughout Latin America, many of the institutions that I used to engage with, which were behind us, are now in front of us. It's not because of lack of resources. It's not lack of human resources. It's just that strategically, our intent is being distracted by a whole range of things that are not taking us anywhere closer to our target. We must stop doing that.
Yeah, we shall.
We shall stop doing
We shall.
that.
Gillian, and finally.
I will do that with this Diaspora Center. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is around recognizing that the DEC is a separate and independent entity to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Both the Ministry and the DEC will be involved in diaspora engagements and strategic work. How do we avoid duplication of effort or contradictory themes and projects going forward?
But that's simple. I mean, this is a Caribbean initiative. What the ministry is doing is focused on Guyana. And so there's a clear division of labor. But there's also the Bureau Research academic institution with a very specific mandate of generating knowledge, disseminating that knowledge, and doing the outreach. So that's a very different enterprise from what would be expected of a ministry, for example. They're overlapping themes. But it's not just overlapping here in Guyana, it's overlapping in Trinidad, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti, and that's the beauty of it. We are not trying to be everything to everybody. It is impossible. What we are saying is that there is a niche. There is nobody connecting the dots. There is no one repository for knowledge on the diasporic economy or the Caribbean diaspora. There's no one go-to place to at least get a picture of what this full sum is. That is the role of the Diaspora Engagement Center, which is very different from what would be expected from Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a specific country.
Good. Finally.
Make clear for
Take this mic.
if you don't mind.
The difference between CARICOM, the University of the West Indies, and the DEC. And that's just a part. I just need that cleared up before I present my question. CARICOM, and maybe the CARICOM curse of frequent flyer miles. The University of the West Indies, being cognizant of there being an evaluation unit, which is quite a heavy repository of knowledge and Caribbean research. What would be the competitive advantage for the DEC, being aware of these two organizations?
Our definition of Caribbean for the purposes of this Senate is not just CARICOM Caribbean. We're looking to see Archipelago Caribbean, which includes Dominican Republic and Haiti and Puerto Rico and Cuba, in addition to mainland Caribbean, including the French Département de Mer, including the Spanish Antilles islands that are appendages of some kind. CARICOM has a discrete part of the Caribbean element. By the same token, University of the West Indies, that has a mandate for instruction and research, will be doing some things that other universities, and including University of Guyana, does. But I think the absence of any structured initiative on this topic, and I would see us embracing UE as a strategic partner, gives us the opportunity not only to establish lead, but to establish with University of the West Indies and with entities in those other than CARICOM Caribbean countries. For example, University of Puerto Rico, where many of us have very good friends. I can see us building a strategic partnership with them quite early. They are established, credible, long-standing universities in Dominican Republic, in other parts of the Caribbean. So I don't see an issue. Is there likely to be some duplication? Yes. But I would much prefer to start with what might be duplication, and as we calibrate, as we reconcile, we narrow the gaps and reduce the duplication and have more collaboration. And it was in that context that I said, I met Vice President Greenwich last year, September. And I said, Minister, here are two things I'd like to put on the table. Part of my reorganization of the leadership team entails the establishment of a Deputy Vice Chancellor for Planning and International Engagement. I'd like to find a way for synergy between Ministry of Foreign Affairs and University of Guyana. As we do our international thing, how can you support us, how can we support you? But I also said to him, I'm starting this diaspora engagement project. I'd love to have the ministry involved, because although the mandates and the missions will be different, there's going to be some overlap. There's going to be the need for some synergy. And he immediately said, yes, I will. Said, let's get our diaspora unit person involved. It was not Mr. Burleson at first. So I don't see the complication, because there's a different zone of engagement that CARICOM has, which is only part of the Caribbean. I've got a good friend I'm sure of Keith, David Lewis, who likes to remind people quite accurately that Cuba alone has more people than all the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean combined. So when you're talking about the Caribbean and you're only referring to the English-speaking Caribbean, you are not representing the fulsomeness of the Caribbean. This will be a project where we have to embrace the entire Caribbean. Now, I don't know if we want to go to the Caribbean basin at first, to the Nicaragua, to the Honduras, to the Guatemala, Belize, to the Mexico, but it at least has got to start with the Archipelago Caribbean and the mainland of South America and the Central American inclusion of Belize. Thank you.
Okay, so here comes my question.
I know the question is going to be very brief.
Very brief, very brief. You speak to legislation, leadership, and finance. May I proffer that except the widespread bottom of the pyramid diaspora, the diaspora of the diaspora really are engaged, then you've reinvented the wheel without the spokes. When I read the document, and I get the sense that Dr. So-and-so will be engaged, and Dr. So-and-so has been invited to participate, and Dr. So-and-so. I feel left out. I'm working on my doctorate, but I wouldn't be invited to the table just yet. And I'm wondering if there isn't a base that really forms the diaspora. The meat and potatoes people that hold the meetings in New York and wash the dishes. Those people, how can they feel as if they're a part of not maybe the research, but the actual research? When will projects be done on those lesser Guyanese, those working Guyanese, those youths that are left behind, those single parents that are Guyanese, those Guyanese who were married twice, both in New York and here, to get their visas. Those real Guyanese. Sir, I have done a project in my bachelor's degree called the Millennium
You did
Home.
say a brief question, right?
Yes, sir, absolutely, absolutely. And it dealt with that, the real Guyanese out there. And further, I do not see that engagement. I'd like to know, even as we leave this conference, that those of us who put those pennies together, made it here, made our numbers increase, are not left behind because they did not say me, to be able to speak. So is there some intentionality from your leadership point to make sure that the real Guyanese and the real diaspora, so that if this could be somehow revised to speak to the left behind?
I think I get the question.
Yes, sir. Yes,
So
sir.
here's the answer.
Thank you.
If you look at the composition of the participants here, you'll find not only PhDs or doctors. That is part of the evidence of what we're doing. If you look at the leadership preparing this conference, the planning committee, you'll find not only PhDs, not only doctors. In other words, the representativeness of the diaspora that will be the basis for going forward is manifested in this very conference, in who helped to organize the conference, in who we put the call out to. There was nothing that said you can respond to the call only if you have a master's or a doctorate. There is nothing that said you can only respond to the call if you've got at minimum 50 years. I am conscious, I know Keith is conscious, that as we embrace this diaspora, we've got to be diversity conscious. That is in there. Give yourselves a round of applause for being important participants.
One last thing. I always try to temper our expectations. Our goal is not to be everything to everybody. Our role is to connect the dots. What I mean by that? To be an aggregator, to be a convener, to be what the person was suggesting, to be an advocate. Touching every Caribbean diaspora personality in every location will be way beyond our resource capabilities. There are people who are already doing those things. What we want to do is elevate the work that they are doing, not to replicate what they are doing. There's a role for a university that's very distinct from the role of a hometown association or a village community association, etc. So let us not create expectations that we know that we will never ever achieve. That's what I mean by implementation deficit disorder. We go from not doing anything to wanting everything all in the same breath. And you know what? Well, that won't work. Okay? So let us be judicious, circumspect, and focused. There is a niche, there is a gap which we are trying to fill, which is that coordination, collaboration element. We cannot do much more beyond that, at least in the first few years. So be patient with the expectations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me end on two notes. First is to encourage anyone who wants to be part of this project. I want to thank Esleen for offering. Please give your name to Chief of Staff. If you want to be considered for the advisory board, let us know. Again, we're looking for Mautar and guitar. And once you sign up, colleagues in this room who know me, if you promise me something, I'm going to ensure that you honor the promise. So if you don't want to do and you just want to say, don't go to my chief of staff. Let me invite Mr. Brotherson to share a few final observations. And then the Education Resource Ambassadors, please join us in room 2.
Thank you, Professor Griffith. Actually, it's just one comment I have to make, and I want to refer to the Honorable Minister of State's presentation. And I think he ended in part by requesting, urging you participants to make your comments, suggestions, send questions as they relate to the Diaspora Engagement Strategy, the draft strategy. I will be here throughout the rest of the conference until Friday evening, as well as my staff, Mr. Arlington, Sophie. So please contact us for information on how to get to us, those of you who do not have our cards. And we welcome your comments by email, questions, suggestions. Let them come as you see them fit, and we'll be happy to take them on board and pass them on as appropriate. Thank you very much.